When you think about it, how do we actually make sense of our incredibly complex world? I mean, from understanding why economies grow to figuring out what causes wars, we need reliable ways to find answers, right? Well, this is the story of two very different and often competing ways of doing just that. And that's really the big question, isn't it? Our world is messy. You can just put an entire country in a test tube and run an experiment. So, how do we figure out if a new policy actually worked, or if things were just changing on their own anyway? It's a huge challenge, and the search for an answer has basically split the world of social science right down the middle. So, on one side, you've got the quantitative culture. Think massive spreadsheets, statistics, and hunting for broad patterns across thousands of examples. They're asking, what is happening on a huge scale? Then, on the other side, you have the qualitative culture. This is more like detective work, deep historical dives, trying to understand the why behind one specific event. And for a long, long time, these two groups didn't just use different tools, they basically spoke different languages. All right, so here's the roadmap for this explainer. First, we're going to really dig into these two cultures. Then, we'll look at a really bold attempt to unite them and the huge debate it kicked off. We'll also uncover the unique power of a good story in science. And finally, see how a smarter, combined approach might just be the future. Okay, so let's start with that fundamental divide. What really, at its core, makes these two ways of knowing so different from each other? The quantitative world is all about breadth. It uses what scientists call large N, where N is just the number of things you're studying, to find those big, sweeping patterns. Imagine a massive spreadsheet analyzing election results from every single district in a country. The qualitative world, on the other hand, is all about depth. It uses a small n, maybe just a handful of cases, and goes incredibly deep to understand the specific story. It's less about that giant spreadsheet and way more about a detective's notebook, filled with clues about one single mystery. So for decades, these two cultures pretty much operated in their own separate worlds. But then, in the 1990s, this one book came along that tried to build a bridge, or, as some people might say, it tried to stage a takeover. The book was called Designing Social Inquiry, but honestly, everyone just calls it KKV after its authors, King, Keohane, and Verba. And it is really hard to overstate the impact this thing had. It landed like a bombshell in the social sciences, and it quickly became one of the most influential and, one of the most controversial books on research ever written. KKV's mission was incredibly ambitious. They basically argued that it doesn't matter if you're analyzing a giant data set or a single historical event. You should be following the exact same scientific rules. And what were those rules? Well, essentially, the rules of statistics. The whole idea was to push all research into one scientific template, bringing, they hoped, a new level of rigor to qualitative work. But as you can imagine, this attempt at a unified theory did not go over well with everybody. A huge pushback started, and not just from the qualitative folks, but from quantitative scholars too. They argued that, hey, one size does not fit all, and that KKV's approach completely ignored some really serious problems lurking inside the world of statistics itself. So one of the big critiques is what people call the kitchen sink problem. In statistics, there's this tool called a regression model, which helps test how different factors relate to an outcome. Well, the temptation is to just throw every possible variable into the model, everything but the kitchen sink, hoping you'll explain what's going on. But more data doesn't always lead to more clarity. And this gets to a real danger. As the political scientist Christopher Hitchens warned, these super complex models can get so flexible that they just wrap themselves around any data set. They end up explaining all the random noise instead of the real story, which gives you this false sense of certainty while actually just making things way more confusing. So the numbers first approach has its own massive hurdles to clear. There's selection bias, like if you only poll people who still have a landline phone, your results are going to be skewed, right? And then there's the problem of ruling out other explanations when you can't run a perfect experiment. And seriously, how do you even measure a huge complex idea like democracy with just a single number? It's pretty clear that statistics alone are no magic bullet. So what's the alternative? Well, on the other side of this great divide, we find the unique power of the qualitative toolkit. This approach is way less about statistics and way more about detective work, just reconstructing a story piece by piece to figure out exactly what happened. And the key tool for this detective work is something called the causal process observation, or CPO. Now, I know that sounds super complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. It's not just another data point, it's a crucial clue.
It's that one piece of evidence, a leaked memo or revealing interview, that helps you finally understand the how and the why of the story. It's the smoking gun.
And check out this detective work in action. During a deadly cholera outbreak in London, Dr. John Snow started by just mapping the deaths. He saw they were all clustered around one water pump. But the real breakthrough? That came from his CPOs, his crucial clues. He found out that workers at a nearby brewery weren't getting sick because they drank free beer instead of water. And he found a woman who died miles away, but it turns out she had water from that specific pump delivered to her every day just because she liked the taste. Those clues proved the pump was the source, long before anyone even knew what a germ was.
Now, this kind of detective work isn't just random guessing. It has its own tough standards. A great example is the hoop test. The logic is really simple. If your theory is true, it has to be able to explain certain key facts. It has to jump through a necessary hoop. So for instance, if you think that public opinion stopped Britain from going to war in 1898, but you find evidence that the public was actually screaming for war, well, your theory fails the hoop test. It's a really powerful way to weed out bad explanations. So, where does that leave us? Are we just stuck in some endless war between spreadsheets and stories? Not at all. Actually, the most exciting research happening today isn't about picking a side. It's about building a smarter science that combines the power of both. This new approach is often called nested inference. And the idea behind it is beautifully simple. You start with a telescope, using big data to spot a strange pattern out there in the stars. Then you grab your microscope, and you use those qualitative tools to zoom in on a few of those stars to figure out the deep story of what's really going on. So here's what that looks like in practice. Step 1, you use stats to identify a pattern, like the famous finding that democracies almost never fight each other. Step 2, you select a few crucial cases, maybe a couple of times when two democracies came right to the brink of war. Step 3, you trace the process. You dive into the archives, do the interviews, and you figure out exactly why they pulled back. And finally, step 4, you refine your theory. You use those deep insights to build a much richer, more powerful explanation than either method could ever get to on its own.
So really, the ultimate takeaway here isn't about picking a winner in some kind of academic cage match. It's about having a full toolbox. A great researcher doesn't just own a hammer. They have a whole range of tools, and they have the wisdom to know exactly which one is right for the job. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought. To understand our messy, complicated, totally fascinating world, we really need both, don't we? We need the telescope to see the broad patterns of the stars, and we need the microscope to understand the intricate life happening inside a single drop of water. Relying on just one is never, ever going to give us the full picture.